This is History 1302 and a lecture on the Gilded Age era, particularly about social Darwinism, and the rise of the challenge and changes affecting the United States in the late 19th century. When we talk today about these intellectual changes, really we're talking about not just intellectual changes that you find in the science lab and theories and so forth. You also find these changes affecting theology and also the church. As I might have said to you once before in lecture, the church was a bedrock of American society prior to the Civil War. It was the church that establishes many of the great higher institutions of higher learning prior to the Civil War, the Harvards and the Princetons and the Yales, for example. And it was the church that was one of the primary institutions beyond the theology, beyond the doctrine, beyond the religion. It was a social group and it was a social cohesion. And one of the most important individuals in the church, in the society, prior to the Civil War and even after the Civil War in some areas was the pastor himself. But that all has begun to change, and will begin to change by the time you get to the Civil War. And it is one of my working theses, I guess, for this class, is that on the one hand, you're seeing the changes of the United States brought by the Civil War. These great cataclysmic events, a civil war, or economic crisis, or a disease, or some sort of other event that either breaks upon you suddenly or slowly but surely. You see it coming, and you can't avoid it, and it just is going to take either the lives or the confidence of many, many people. And the country will never be the same again. And so that's, I think, where we are here when we talk about these changes that are being wrought in the United States. As I have said before, I think the cracks in the foundation of the Protestant church, and remember, when we talk about this in American context, America was founded not as a Christian nation. I don't subscribe to that notion. I've heard people talk about that over the years and say America was a Christian nation. It was Christian in the sense that most of the people who settle the English-speaking colonies in America were Christian of some sort or another. Whether that be Roman Catholic like in Maryland, or free-thinking types in Rhode Island, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Cavalier Anglicans in Virginia, obviously Puritan Congregationalists and Presbyterians, and on we can go. Yes, there were quite a few Americans who were Christian. That's no doubt about that prior to the Civil War. But to say we were a Christian nation, that stretches it a little bit there. I think that's a little bit playing fast and loose with language. But it is to say, though, that the church is very influential, and more especially if you were to say, was it Catholic or Protestant, Protestant being defined as Lutheran or Methodist or Baptist or something like that, or was America more Catholic, Roman Catholic? The answer was it was very Protestant prior to the Civil War. Obviously, during the Civil War, before the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War, adherents to the Catholic Church are going to move in mass numbers to the United States out of various parts of Europe and beyond, but especially Europe. But still, in elite circles in the United States prior to the Civil War and even after the Civil War, it was the Protestant church that was going to have the most adherents, especially, say, Congregationalism or Presbyterianism or maybe Methodism, respectable Methodism. Not so much the Baptists. The Baptists were always considered by many in elite circles as kind of rambunctious, a poor man's church, etc., and so on. But you will see that the church is still very vibrant coming into the Civil War era. But those cracks and seams that are running through the authority of the church probably were actually established even before America's foundation. It was probably best served and said perhaps that the initial cracks and worry about the authority of the church and questions to the authority of the church might have taken place not in 1859 is where we'll pick up formally, but it took place perhaps in the age of the Enlightenment. Questions about, serious and full questions about of the nature of miracles. Can they be true? Did that really happen in the Bible? Jonah and the well, classically, is an example. The miracles of Jesus, and so on. But as in that Enlightenment period, which would be the 16 and 1700s, in that Enlightenment period that closes with Napoleon and the collapse of the French Revolution, collapse of Napoleon's empire, and so on, The answer was basically, though, is that perhaps amongst elite circles, intellectual circles, they would say that the Bible is wrong in certain areas. Perhaps it's not quite right, but in the whole, it is a truthful and a factual, not just spiritual, but a factual book, and we can take it for granted. And so that was the thing. And really the issue for the Enlightenment skeptics, and there were skeptics out there, skeptics regarding religion and the authenticity of the Bible and who authored it. Those skeptics out there still couldn't get around the issue of in the beginning. Well, who in the beginning was the Creator? How did we get here? And so the Bible's answer is very famously, and others can take it out of different faith examples and so on, but since we're talking American history, it's going to be the Bible. Famously in the Bible, the first verse of Genesis 1 goes like this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then after that, you can argue the details out in this fashion and that fashion, but still, the answer was always until 1859, in the beginning, who created? Well, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, again, after that, you work your way out. But that brings us to 1859. So remember your dates, and I don't always make a big deal about dates, but here we are, and I think it's worth remembering that the dates here are important. Even if I don't test you directly on this date or that date, it's important to remember from an American historical perspective, 1859 is on the doorstep of the American Revolution, and in 1860, American Revolution, the American Civil War, but in 1860 and 61, the American Civil War begins. And as I've said before to you, I think one of the things that erodes the confidence of the intellectual elite is that Civil War. The randomness of it all, violence that you can't recognize, how did it happen, doubts about your own authority and winningness, the fact that you have shortly after the Civil War, you have people who are taking Robert E. Lee, who can arguably be called a traitor, and certainly a sedition fomenter. Robert E. Lee and his butternut-clad troops were the real heroes of the war. They were the true men of the war, and they weren't some sort of cold, mechanical, lifeless form like the Union Army would be, or say a primitive like Ulysses S. Grant. The true human was the Southern Army, and there will some buy into that lost cause mythology. But in 1859, Charles Darwin is going to publish his very famous book on the origin of species. And it is published first in England, and later will be published, later that year, in fact, will be published in the United States. The Civil War had the effect, though, of sucking the oxygen on an American sense, sucking the oxygen out of the room on Darwin. But to spend a few minutes talking about Darwin, we need to consider the fact that he did not arrive with his idea, the origin of the species, the theory of evolution, and so forth, just out of a vacuum that happened, or a very quick analysis. Darwin, in fact, actually is going to be born in 1809, so he's not a young man when he finally publishes his famous book. And he publishes several famous books, including The Descent of Man, which takes a much darker overtone than does The Origin of the Species. Well, anyways, in 1809, he's born in England, and he actually studies initially to be a priest, a rector in the Anglican Church. The thing, though, is that when it comes to Darwin and his studies and his practice and his thinking toward faith and science and so forth, he always had an interest, and many actual pastors have over the years. If your concept of a pastor, your concept of a preacher or a bishop or an overseer or an elder or whatever your term is that they're only concerned about the Bible and only concerned about church, that's a very unfortunate understanding. There's several others that come to mind very readily: Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, a man I may have mentioned just once before, Manasseh Cutler. All these are famous American preachers or pastors or theologians who were interested in far more than just being good preachers. Yes, that's there. But they were also interested in medicine and law and theology and geology and natural botany and so on and so on. And it's a very expansive reading. So a pastor who dabbles, or a man thinking about the clergy, becoming a preacher, or in this case an Anglican rector or priest, thinking about becoming a rector, but yet having interest in natural sciences and such, not unusual coming out of that Enlightenment period. Oftentimes you'll hear even thoroughgoing Christians, thoroughgoing doctrinal Christians call and make references to God as nature's God, as providence, and so on. You see that, I would argue, George Washington was, in his own way, in his own right, a thoroughgoing Christian, but he'll often refer to God not as God, or sometimes God, but also refer to him as nature's God, providence, and so on. But the difference between Darwin and Washington and Darwin and those other thinkers, such as an Edwards especially, or say Manasseh Cutler and others, is that those men did not lose their faith in the Bible, their faith in the authenticity and the not just the authenticity, but the authority of the Bible and the authority of the church and the truth claims of the church. Because what we're dealing with here are worldviews. We're dealing with truth claims. Who's right ultimately? Is it the Bible in the main? Is it the church in the main as far as the origins of the earth? Or is it, when we're here talking about Darwin and all that goes with Darwin, is it Darwin? Because early on, you can try to sweep aside and say it can all work together in some nice little knitting together, but quite honestly, that's a hard marriage to make at times. It's perhaps like marrying a Mercedes-Benz with an Audi. It doesn't; they don't mesh together very well. You can maybe do it, but it's a hard slog. But Darwin in 1831 is going to book passage and travel very famously to the South Pacific. And he's going to be on the HMS Beagle, and there at the Galapagos Islands, he's going to come across and he's going to start to ruminate and to read and to think on this the idea of evolution. And it doesn't just break upon him just boom with a full understanding, but it's there. Perhaps the word might be better said for your notes, natural selection. All that to say, though, is that in 1838, another important year in the development of Darwin and his theories, is that Darwin is going to read a book by a man named Thomas Malthus. And it is basically this, it's called an essay on the principles of population. Thomas Malthus wrote the essay on the principles of population in 1798. So one of the things we always got to remember is that ideas have consequences, and even ideas that are not going to be accepted in the time period in which they're written, they can lay dormant on a shelf, much like a germ or a virus or something else. That's negative, of course, but at the same time, you could say is the dormancy of a seed, perhaps. A seed can be very good, obviously, with trees and wildflowers and what have you. It can lay dormant for a while, and then by somebody else's hand, the idea be picked up and run with. And Thomas Malthus was a very negative individual. Basically, Malthus, who's an Englishman, comes to the conclusion that there's too many people, too many mouths to feed. There's just going to be, the earth is going to be overrun with people, is overrun. It's not just a future tense, is present tense in 1798, and his basic idea is there should be perhaps a culling of society, a reduction. The shortages of food and war and death. It's very dystopian, very negative, very dark. And for many of you watching this, you probably watched in the last year or so the Avengers series with, what was his name, Thanos, the great arch villain of the whole series, especially there at the last two. Was it Infinity War and Endgame? But when we talk about Thanos, wasn't his basic premise and the reason he was acting is there are just too many people, and especially at the end of the second movie, the end of the first movie I mentioned, Infinity War, he is able to put on the glove, he's able to kill half of the population of the known world or the universe, I suppose, and then essentially save. His idea was to reduce population and so forth, and create this Eden, this panacea. When I watched that movie, I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is just basically Thomas Malthus and Malthusian dystopia. Well, anyways, in 1838, Darwin reads this, and his thinking's like, well, it informs his thinking, and as he ruminates and thinks on Malthus's ideas, plus what he had observed at the Galapagos Islands with the HMS Beagle, he starts to come up with this idea, and he starts to adopt this idea that over time, through just simple, slow, monotonous, slow evolutionary process, species adapt. And over time, they struggle, and those who struggle and win and survive, those are the winners. Those who lose, they were the weak, and they go into extinction. And it's just a slow but surely progressing, to use a term, progressing evolution to a higher and more improved set of eyes and ears and nose and society and so on. And it's not just the physical, it's always going to be just also societal as well. But especially here with Darwin, especially in 1859, when he publishes the book, it's going to be the uplift of the individual, the uplift of the person. And something else that's important about Darwin and his thinking, too, that's worth noting, and this is where Charles Hodge, Hodge, Charles Hodge, a Princeton theologian of the late 19th century, or mid to late 19th century, Charles Hodge, a fundamental churchman of the First Order. He is a Orthodox Presbyterian theologian, but at the same time he reads widely. Like, as I said, a lot of those preachers do. They have interest beyond just the four walls of the church. Charles Hodge reads Darwin's On the Origin of the Species in the 1860s. I believe it was the 65, 66. It was not, as I recall, the day after it was published, but he read it, and Hodge saw immediately what was the fly in the ointment, the pterodactyl in the ointment for the church. It was that the fact was that this is a competing truth claim. This is a competing origin story. The thing is that what you get with Darwin is that particularly in an early sense is that how do we get here? Well, the answer is we've always been here, and it's always from the smallest of molecules, the smallest of atoms, slowly perhaps evolving out of that to what we have. And there is no design to it in the sense that there is no God hovering above that designs humanity or designs the cells. It just always was, and then it kicks into motion, and slowly but surely here we come. It's taken millions of years, but slowly but surely. There's no design. It's all perhaps merely accident. And so by 1859, Charles Darwin, who was actually a very at least initially, at least for most of his life, he was actually a very quiet man. He's not a blowtorch like some of the other characters you get during this time period. He doesn't really go for the aggressive change or turning of people to his way of thinking. But as far as Darwin is concerned, Charles Darwin is actually going to settle on this idea of evolution somewhere around 1838, 39, in that territory through there. And he sits on it. In fact, he basically sits on this because, well, in some circles, it might bring some condemnation and hardships and heartburn on your head if you essentially bow up and say, no, what we thought we knew for generations and generations, centuries and centuries was essentially wrong, and that there is no greater design. There is no God designing anything. There was no in the beginning. It was just always was. And so when you talk about Darwin, and that aspect of his thinking is he sat on it. It wasn't until 1859 when others in England's scientific and thinking community had kind of started to nose into and were about to steal Darwin's thunder in the sense that they were going to take his great insight. And so that's what pushed him to publish On the Origin of Species in 59. And of course it will be updated in multiple editions and so forth, in addition to other books such as The Descent of Man and so forth. But it's worth noting that the phrase that is oftentimes associated with Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, does not appear in this initial version. It does appear in like the 6th or 7th version, or meaning edition, but the initial edition of On the Origin of Species does not appear there. But a second person that is worth noting here, and we'll bring in, is a guy named Herbert Spencer. And by the way, I do want to say this. There will be people who will pick at Darwin and churchmen who will pick at Darwin, and even those who aren't churchmen but just skeptical of this idea of no design. You can be a believer in deity, but you don't have to go to a church to do that. And by the way, one was a botanist named Asa Gray. And if you would give me a second here to read the quote from Asa Gray, and that how this theory of evolution works out. For Gray, it was preposterous in a sense. How can you get, Gray's going to use the eye as a classic example. And this is what Gray writes actually to Darwin. He says, the eye, Gray writing, says, is an enormously complex organ made up of numerous finely tuned components. But the development of any one of these components individually conveyed absolutely nothing in the way of advantages in the struggle for survival. Not until all these changes and adaptations were all added up and finally composed in the eye were they of any use. How then were they permitted that long a period of accumulation when they conferred no help whatsoever to the owner? So that was Gray's question: is how if all these parts have come together, and we're talking survival of the fittest, that's not Darwin's initial term. It casts some doubt, and to this day, people will have doubts about Darwin's theory on evolution for reasons like that. Anyways, Darwin replied to Gray to suppose, this is Darwin's reply, to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. But all that to say, though, is that Darwin's theories, even met with the skepticism and doubt, saying, and some of it has to do with how did you come to this theory? Did you come across some facts and put it all together and get the theory, or did you have the theory and the facts, inductive versus deductive reasoning? And Darwin's going to be picked at it. Yet his theory, to this day, 2020, when this is being recorded, is going to be the dominant theory in many science departments, in many botany and anthropological departments about how did we get here to this day. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm not asking you to disbelieve it. But to be fair, Darwin has carried the field. But to the second issue, too, though, happens to come from Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is another one of these characters we'll come across from time to time. Especially Herbert Spencer is the man who's going to coin the term survival of the fittest. And Herbert Spencer, in his own curmudgeonly way, is a very, very big skeptic. He is not a believer in revealed religion, and in fact, actually, something that, as we've gone through this semester, one of the things you've seen me hammer away at is the importance of railroads. Now, obviously, railroads can take lots of important forms in different ways. We don't need to rehearse all those discussions. But one of the things that's also important is that there are a lot of thoughtful and learned men who are going to study and become railroaders, going to become engineers, are going to be working on the railroad, one of which in Great Britain was Herbert Spencer. But Spencer also had an interest in geology. And if you think about railroading, one of the things you need to know about is rocks. Because, as we talked about in the laying of track, the best tracks are laid on a bed full of rocks, that they are the stable, and it keeps the track smooth, and it makes the trains run faster, and perhaps on time. But Herbert Spencer, because of his interest in geology and the natural sciences, Spencer is going to be looking at these rocks that are being produced for the ballast in the beds of his railroads there in Great Britain, and he keeps noticing all these old fossils in there. And so what Spencer is going to settle upon is this idea that life existed long before the 3,000 or so years that the Bible talks about, that there was some definite changes that had gone on. Perhaps there are changes that we didn't recognize. He hits on it in his own way. And in the year 1838, like Darwin, in 1838, he too reads Thomas Malthus's essays on war, poverty, famine, and so forth. And basically, Malthus is going to be influential in the eyes of and in the ways of Herbert Spencer. Spencer, long story short, is going to leave his job as a railroader and go on speaking tours. And he's going to become a prominent figure in this social Darwinist idea. And in fact, Herbert Spencer would say this: congratulations. And I'm putting some words in his mouth for drama. But when you're talking about Spencer, who is, by the way, going to be received and applauded by some churchmen, more than you might imagine. I think it's worth noting that there were a good number of many churchmen who were quite comfortable with the idea of survival of the fittest, evolution of the species, as long as you could marry that to, in the beginning, God created. But Spencer would say to those who are watching this, congratulations. You are the man or woman who survived. So you can pat yourself on the back, congratulate yourself. You and your ancestors before you were the fit. You survived. You are the best. And so, on top of that, Spencer would go so far to say, too, and he was very much an extreme, to use a modern political term, an extreme libertarian. A libertarian would say, let there be, excuse me, as I cough, let there be destruction in society. Destruction is a good thing. Not destruction in the sense like you blow something up with an explosion, but natural destruction, whether that come in the form of economic hardship or come in the form of plague, culling the herd, and so on. And considering when I'm recording this, those are some hard words. But Spencer would say that's good. That's good because you're wanting to bring society to higher and higher levels, evolutionary higher levels, the survival of the fittest. And so when you lose the weak and you cull the incapable, you're doing society a favor. And in fact, actually, this is the way Spencer put it. And in fact, perhaps he would say you needed to clear the world of the weak and the infirm because they need to make room for the better. And then on top of that, Spencer would say you don't need to help anybody. In fact, Spencer would say the government does the least, this is that libertarian stuff, the government does that does the least is the best government possible because it does so little, it is able to therefore allow natural selection, survival of the fittest, the cream of the crop rising to the top. That is Spencer's hope. But he quoted and go on further about how destruction and misery and hardship should be a companion, not a foreigner, not a distant relative to humanity. And this is the way Spencer said it. Quote, nothing should come between people and suffering. Because suffering is the greatest teacher. Charity is nothing but the artificial preservation of those least able to take care of themselves. Now, Herbert Spencer saying those sorts of quotes like that, going on these speaking tours, advocating a survival of the fittest mantra for society, government, and life, as you can imagine, despite what maybe some, at best, I would argue, well-meaning churchmen might would speak on, the fact is that this runs counter to much of the ideas of the church. If you were to say, if you think about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and say the Epistle of James in the New Testament, the church has taught for years and years to help the weaker, to help the lesser, to help the widow and orphan, to take care of those who need assistance and so forth. Do more. So anyways, that's the creed of the church in an actional charity sort of way. Spencer is throwing charity away and he's saying, no, don't do it. Now, think about this. So Spencer, who is an Englishman, is going to have his ideas brought to the Americas, and his ideas are going to be published widely and will be read in other places. If your concept of a better life is that you need to cull the weak out and to thin the herd, as it were. These are dramatic terms I know I'm using, but this is Spencer's revolutionary thinking. And Darwin is going to be swept up in it. Go read The Descent of Man. It's eerily similar. But all this to say, though, is that it's one thing to say, okay, this is just the natural evolution over time. Over time, it'll happen. It'll take care of itself. But to the knavish individual, the cunning and destructive, the wicked and the scoundrel, especially those who are very learned and convinced of their own superiority and righteousness, and I use those terms, most of them moral terms, because they would think of themselves as the new priest of a better age. It doesn't take too much to start figuring out and say, okay, if we want to have survival of the fittest and a better and more healthy society, a more advanced society, a smarter society, a physically stronger society, and we need to allow the weak to die off, as it were, as Spencer would argue, and others like him. You might see some say, perhaps, what about those who are born with Down syndrome or something of that nature? Should they be allowed to have children themselves? What about the fact of the matter is you may test for economics and such? The fact of the matter, what would you do there? If you look at, say, some individuals who their IQ is not as high as you'd hope it to be, that IQ test shows that they have perhaps some learning and mental disabilities, perhaps you shouldn't allow them to procreate, meaning to have children and offspring. You used to actually see this in the United States in a very famous court case called Buck versus Bell in 1927. I would suggest you take a look at it, read it. It's rather interesting. But even going further still, you can have not only those arguments there, but what about the argument that perhaps not only is there so many people who need the help to be prevented from procreating, how about not have them at all? So I guess what I'm saying is that it doesn't take a whole lot of working and thinking is that if you ever wondered where the Nazis got some of their ideas, particularly with regard to the handicapped, those who are of Down syndrome or other mental and learning disabilities and so forth, the Nazis drank very deeply out of these wells of survival of the fittest, Spencer's ideas and so forth. But basically, they would say government and the society needs to help along by implementing policies to cull the weak out and so forth. The Nazis were very wicked. Make no mistake about that. Very, very wicked and evil, and I mean that in the fullest of moral terms. However, the thing is when we talk about these, the Nazis, they didn't just dream them up one night. They were informed through, amongst other places, Spencerian survival of the fittest. Because remember this about the Nazis, like the communists as well, they are basically atheists, do not believe in deity or God or anything like that. So all that to say, though, is that that's the very dark side that you get with Spencer's thinking coming into the 20th and into the middle part of the 20th century. But in addition to that, however, Darwin's ideas on evolution and where we come from and so forth, despite the hijacking at times by others, Darwin's ideas are still very influential to this day. In fact, most of you taking science classes will be taught some form or advancement or a modernization or a forwarding, or excuse me, a development of Darwin's theory of evolution. Where do we come from? But to sum this up, though, is this, I hope you understand, is where you really see a sea change, is that no longer could the church is going to have the issue not only just of we doubt the miracles. That was the Enlightenment issue, amongst other things. But the Enlightenment never could answer where we came from. Now, because of Darwin and his acolytes and the people that follow after him and take his theories and run with it, for good and for bad, they're going to be able to say, where did we come from? Where did we come from? Well, some would say, we've always been here. And it just is that natural evolution through survival of the fittest in a benign way or a good way versus the dark and evil ways, perhaps, of the Third Reich. But those ideas, the Darwinian ideas, are certainly still current and are there. But what it does is it presents and erodes further the authority of the church. Again, as I always say in these lectures, this is not designed to make you think, and it is not designed to make you believe that everybody quit going to church in 5 years and they just all became agnostic or something. That's not true. However, in elite circles, which would be in the Ivy Leagues, which would be in government, it would be in places of high influence, small in number, but influential in authority, there is an erosion of faith and an erosion of belief that is accelerated by Darwin and Darwinian thinking. Again, as I've said to you in another lecture, you've got the Ivy Leagues teaching these sorts of things. You've got university teaching these ideas in a general sense. Not the seminaries like Crawford Toy. That's a different animal. Seminaries train preachers. But you see the erosion of the position of the church. And so if you ever wondered why people, in a sense, lost their faith, the church, the society became less religious, at least in a Christian sense, I think you can find some of your answers right here. There's maybe a whole lot of reasons why, but I think some of it is right here. But this is fundamental stuff. These are big changes that are afoot in the United States and, frankly, in Europe as well. So it's worth noting, and that's where we draw to close for this lecture. Thank you for listening.